I used to live round the corner from the British Museum, which is one of the world's great treasure troves of history and culture. One thing I love is how it can bring the world of the Bible to life. These corridors tell of long-forgotten cities, battles and kings who once ruled the fate of nations. And one of those nations was ancient Israel. And these sculptures and carvings and monuments are the sorts of things that you'd actually have found in David's palaces or Solomon's temple. Some of the strangest and grandest are these hybrid animals which guarded the doorways of palaces and temples across the ancient Near East. These are from Assyria, but you'd have found them everywhere from Babylon to Jerusalem. In Hebrew, they're called cherubim, which might surprise you because that's a word we still use, but not to describe these. But something like them once guarded the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem, or sat atop the Ark of the Covenant. And so when God spoke to his prophets and people in the Old Testament, he often used visions and pictures of spiritual beings like these, whether positive like the cherubim, or darker and more feral like this one, to bring his glory or his rule or the sweep of history to life. And one place he does that is Daniel, the second half of which is full of, to us, crazy and strange visions. But for Daniel, growing up and living amongst things like this, it would all have made terrifying sense. In the first vision, he sees 4 dark and horrifying beasts rising up out of the sea, representing the power and dominion of a succession of great empires before God casts them down. Daniel 7 to 12 is one of those bits of the Bible that we tend to avoid. It's too strange, too difficult, too overwhelming. But if we let ourselves enter this world and hear the voice of God speaking to us through these strange visions, we'll actually find that they're full of life and relevance to us now. One of the big themes of Daniel that we've touched on but not yet explored in this series is why things don't always work out for us. We love Bible stories that tell of God delivering his people from death or disaster. Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 friends in the fiery furnace. But what about those moments when he does not? When deliverance never comes? Luke and Claire Christian Farman are great friends of mine, and they're full of faith and hope. But a few years ago, their baby daughter, Selah, died at birth.
Luke and Claire, thank you so much for coming and chatting, particularly about something so difficult.
Thank you for having us.
Can I ask, how did you feel when Selah died?
Obviously, a lot of anger, the disappointment, the confusion, nothingness as well. You know, what the heck's happened?
I almost had to focus on even breathing. It came down to, because there was so much shock and trauma, that doing the simplest, the most basic things of functioning took so much effort and so much energy that you really had to concentrate on holding it together and not losing your mind at times.
Hey, when we've spoken before, you've talked about times when you shouted, even swore at God. Tell me about that.
I think, anger with God is, why did this happen? We know you could have intervened, and we know of your miracles and the things that you do so often. Why did this happen? In those next days and weeks and months, it was like the anger would come back sometimes stronger than it was initially. I just had it out with God, if you like. I think that's how I'd probably phrase it.
You were just being real.
It was just being real, and it was...
You were hurting.
It was from a very deep, deep place. It didn't feel surface.
And we'd walk down the street or wherever we were, and we could see mums and dads with their babies, and the questions then come back. We don't want to be victims, but the questions come back like, oh, why us? And it felt like we'd lost everything.
Yeah, there was
And
an emptiness, I suppose.
That was hard.
Amazed by how full of faith you are, and somehow you've managed to hold those unanswered questions, but also alongside still loving Jesus. Claire and Luke's story breaks my heart. And I don't think they or we will probably ever know why and why not. And all our stories are different, but in different ways, at different times, all of them are marred and marked by pain and suffering and death. One thing I love about the Bible, though, is that it meets us in the midst of that struggle and suffering. We can often have quite a simplistic idea in our minds. God loves me, God's great. Must mean that life will always be easy and good. But it's not. And when it's not, that sort of faith can easily shift and crumble. But when we turn to the scriptures, we find something very different. A faith that looks into the face of the darkness, but then finds God's light even in the midst of it. From anguished prayers in the Psalms to the glorious hope of Revelation. And one place which grapples deeply with all of this is the visions at the end of Daniel. The backdrop in Daniel's life is mixed. On one level, things are pretty good. All the visions come later in his life when he's already risen to high office and success and seen amazing moments of God's deliverance and power in his life and those of his friends. And yet, the central wound and scar of his life, his captivity and exile, is never undone. In chapter 9, nearly 70 years later, we see Daniel in prayer, praying and longing for the restoration of Jerusalem and end of the exile. All this time, he's been in Babylon, but his heart was always in Jerusalem. And in his prayer, he cries out to God for grace and mercy for his people. On one level, he understands. Countless prophets foretold the exile and spoke of why it would happen. And so Daniel knows the big reasons. We and our kings, our princes and our ancestors are covered with shame, Lord, because we have sinned against you. And often our struggles are the results of our sin and mistakes. And actually, in those moments, Daniel's prayer is a great comfort and example because he prays into the grace and forgiveness of God. Even when we mess up, even when we cause and deserve the darkness we face, even there, God still loves and cares and helps. And so Daniel can pray, "We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act." But other times there's no link between our sin and our struggles. And that's true in Daniel too. Daniel and his friends are part of a nation that sins, and yet they seem less guilty than most, but are the first to be taken into exile. And in the visions in these later chapters, the kings that rise up and rule are depicted as beasts and enemies of God, and yet for a while they win, while those who honor and follow God suffer pain and persecution. And again, there's something important in that for us, because most of the time, the pains and sufferings that we face in life aren't linked to our sins and mistakes, and we never see or know why they happened. I think it's in moments and struggles like that that the visions of Daniel are most powerful, not because they answer that question why, at least in the details, but because they show us a deeper truth behind everything, that God is still in control, that he does still love us, and that he is still working his purposes and salvation out, even when it looks like he's not. Daniel's prayer is answered, but not as he wants. He's praying into a prophecy in Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years, but the angel Gabriel is sent to him to explain something deeper. He speaks of 77s until God's plans for his people and for Jerusalem are fully resolved. And what that means in practice is that while God's people did return and rebuild Jerusalem after 70 years, in the centuries that followed, they weren't fully free, but buffeted and dominated by first this empire, then that. their sins and problems unresolved, and often facing great persecution and suffering through 77s or weeks of years. And that's what the rest of the visions are about, unfolding the story and pain of God's people through those years.
The first vision is in chapter 7 and is an overview of it all. 4 huge and terrifying beasts rise up out of the sea, symbolising great kings and empires from Daniel's day onwards. And the vision is brutal and appalling, particularly the final beast, which crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. But then he sees a vision of God, the Ancient of Days, enthroned in fire and splendour and waited on by 10,000 times 10,000, and presiding as a judge in the court of heaven. And the beasts are cast down and stripped of their authority, and instead we see another king, this time no beast, but one like a son of man. And he comes not rising from the sea, but riding on the clouds of heaven. And God gives him authority, glory, and sovereign power, and all people worship him.
So what's going on? It can all be a bit overwhelming, and there's lots of arguments and disagreements about what some bits mean or represent, which can put us off or distract us. But don't let it. The vision is supposed to be overwhelming, but with its grand meaning and message clear, even if we miss or misunderstand some of the details. And it's both difficult and glorious. The beasts and darkness will come and will mar our world and history. But even so, God is still in control. And we see that in the glory and ending of this vision, but also in how it reveals what is going to happen in advance. Just stop and think about that for a moment. I look back over the events of my own lifetime, the financial crash, COVID, wars in Ukraine or in Israel and Gaza, and everything else. And sometimes someone spotted 1 or 2 warning signs a few months or even a few years beforehand. But no one really knew what was going to happen with any of them much in advance. Because predicting the future is almost impossible even a few years ahead. But roll the clock on centuries and no one can do it. Except God does do it here.
4 empires rising and falling over 500 years. Maybe something like that could possibly be guessed at. But as the book goes on, that broad brush vision is supplemented by others of staggering detail. In chapter 8, for instance, Daniel has a vision of events 200 years in the future. He sees a ram and a goat, which he's not only told symbolise empires, but named empires of Persia and Greece. And what follows is an extraordinarily accurate prediction of what happens, particularly in the career of Alexander the Great and after. He's presented as the goat, suddenly appearing and charging so swiftly across the whole world that its feet don't touch the ground before trampling the ram of Persia underfoot. Alexander's conquests still stun and surprise historians with their speed, breadth, and unexpectedness. But they didn't surprise God. And neither did the next bit, Alexander's sudden death at the age of just 32, followed by civil war and the division of his empire into 4 parts. Daniel saw it all. At the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. And that's not alone. These visions are full of similar and even finer details. Wars, marriage alliances, and wars averted, all here, shown centuries in advance. It's just not possible unless God really is God, and he really does reign, enthroned above it all, guiding and directing the course of history.
In fact, everyone agrees on that, even those who don't believe in God. This is impossible unless God reigns. The only alternative explanation is that the visions were written after the events they describe, which is what more skeptical scholars believe. Unfortunately, almost no ancient manuscripts of any biblical book survive from this time period, and the other evidence of ancient history is far too patchy and unclear to prove this either way. But that's not really the point. The visions of Daniel aren't there to prove something to skeptics, but to bring comfort and strength to believers, to remind us that God is in control and that his eye is on his people, on us, even when it seems otherwise. And that's actually the next great message of these visions. Why these empires?
There's lots of debate, but the four are probably Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Why not China, or the Indian Mauryan Empire, or the Aztecs or Incas? Because Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome all ruled God's people and Jerusalem. And actually, even then, the focus of these visions can seem a little odd. For instance, Alexander the Great gets some column inches, but far more time is spent unfolding the career of a far lesser later king most people have never heard of, Antiochus IV Epiphanes of Syria. Why? Because he set himself up against God and God's people, stopping and banning all worship of God and persecuting the faithful. He mattered more to their history, and God wanted them to know that even in the midst of persecution, God had not forgotten them. He'd not abandoned them, and awful as those days would be, they would one day come to an end.
And it's the same for us. Life and history can seem bleak and meaningless and as though God's not there. But these visions of Daniel remind us that even when we don't see it, even when we can't feel it, even then, God is still with us. And he does still rule and reign over all.
You were amazing sharing earlier about the struggles and the pain. Can I ask what helped?
We already had a faith. When we lost Sailor, his closeness, I knew his closeness because I'd formed that history of intimacy and relationship with him, and that's what helped.
And I think the idea and the reality of eternity, it all starts to become a little bit more real, and we've got the rest of this life to navigate without our daughter and with a lot of questions, but we actually have got eternity with her.
One of the things that we've been exploring is that sense that even when we don't see it, even when we don't understand it, God is still with us. God does still care for us. I think that's been a part of your experience, that sense of you knew God was Lord of all, you knew God was good, and you chose to lean into it.
There's a bigger story and there's a bigger picture that we don't know about, but he does. And
it's leaning in and trusting that, I think.
Yeah, we just have to trust in that. He is sovereign and he's holy and he knows.
And he's good in the midst of it all.
Yeah.
And I think knowing God with us, knowing the power that he is, that he carries, that he puts within us, to face the day-to-day, to face the next things that came along, we can look back on and think, wow, it proves almost that, wow, God was really, really there. We knew it, but he really, really was there.
Hope and salvation, and why and what we need saving from, is the last great message of Daniel's visions. And it's all focused and summed up in Jesus, who is that final figure in Daniel 7, that one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. This isn't just a message of perseverance, but also one of hope. But that's for next time.